So last autumn, I was traveling along the refugee route from Greece across the Balkan states into Central Europe. It's a journey that more than 1 million people have made in the past year, and in the process created the largest refugee crisis that Europe's seen since the end of the Second World War. So one of these people I met on the trail was an Afghan woman called Fereshta. And she's that woman here in the blue scarf. And for reasons that will become apparent, she has to be anonymous. So I'm afraid you can't see her face. But Fereshta, when I met her, she was utterly exhausted and she was in tears. She had just traveled 500 kilometers on foot from the Macedonian capital of Skopje all the way to the Serbian-Hungarian border. And when she reached the border, she realized that Hungary had shut its gates just a few hours earlier. Now, Fereshta isn't a woman who breaks down easily. I came to know her as an incredibly strong, stoic woman. After the fall of the Taliban, she was the first in her family to go to university. She became a doctor. And at university, she learned perfect English. So, eventually, she began translating for the Canadian ISAF forces in Afghanistan. And that's when she started receiving threats. Every month, word would reach her that if she continued working with foreigners, with the enemy, or if, as a woman, she would continue to work at all, she would be killed. Fereshta kept working. A few weeks after the birth of their 4th child, the Taliban murdered her husband. Fereshta kept working because now she had to support 4 children on her own. But she started begging her Canadian employers to take her and her children with them when they left, to give her a visa. But the visa never came, and the Canadians withdrew. So Fereshta went back to being a doctor at a hospital. And one day, last year, in the spring, her superior at the hospital, also a woman, didn't appear at work. They eventually found her dead in her home, her throat cut, and the throat of her 2-month-old baby son had also been cut. And that was the moment Fereshta decided her children would be safer without her. And the same week, she put her children in the care of a relative, gave all her money to a smuggler, $3,000, and told him to take her as far away from Afghanistan as he was able to. So she went to Turkey. In Turkey, she was afraid of the sea, so she decided to go via the land border to Bulgaria. But the Bulgarians, she told me, beat her, took all her belongings, and pushed her back to Turkey. So, with no other option left, she sold the rest of her belongings, her jewelry, her phone, for a one-way ticket to Greece, like so many others, and made it to the Balkans. So, the route to Europe isn't an easy one. It's a journey that involves walking for miles, for days, in the rain. It involves sleeping in the open, sometimes in squalid camps. I'm sure you've seen the images of Idomeni on the Greek-Macedonian border. It involves walking across potentially mined borders, crossing the sea, confronting tear gas, barbed wire, unfriendly border guards. No one would question why women like Fereshta fled Afghanistan. But when we published her story, I started getting emails, and they mostly, in more or less polite wording, asked the same thing. Why didn't she stay in Turkey? Why, after reaching a safe place, there are no Taliban in Turkey, did she risk her life again to cross the sea, to go to Europe? I mean, one reader wrote, if all these people would just stay in Turkey, we wouldn't have this crisis. Now, except this crisis only became a refugee crisis for Europe when people literally started turning up on our doorstep. For the neighboring countries of Syria, there has been a refugee crisis for 5 years. Tiny Lebanon, every fourth resident is a Syrian refugee. Turkey has taken in 2.5 million Syrians, on top of thousands of others from other nations. So this didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, Europe could have seen it coming. In the previous years, 2013, 2014, every year, the number of people crossing the Mediterranean rose in the summer months. And yet no one expected this so-called flood of 1 million people. Because, as the reasoning goes, all these people fled their home countries and found a safe place in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon. And what else would a refugee want except safety, right? So now imagine you were in a position where you had to flee. You had to flee Porto, let's say. So you choose another safe place that's close. You go, let's say, to Lisbon. And there, now you're an internally displaced person and an IDP. And this is what the Afghan doctor, Fareshta, did. She moved from her native Kandahar to Kabul. But then you discover that actually nowhere in Portugal you're safe. So the next thing is to do, you flee the country to the country next door. You go to Spain. And there you're safe. You've survived. All good, right? Except imagine you're not allowed to work. You don't get government support. So you find a job on the black market, working for 12 hours a day, earning very little money, not enough money to put a roof over your family's head, so your children have to work as well. They can't go to school. So perhaps you'll go to a refugee camp. The camps in Turkey have an amazing reputation, schools are free. And that's okay for a week, a month, maybe a year. But then when the war drags on, and every morning you get up, you have breakfast, you clean your tent, you have lunch, perhaps you watch TV, you have dinner, you go to bed every day. And that's what life looks like for many refugees in Turkey. Turkey deserves every credit in the world for taking 2.5 million, more than any other nation. But of these 2.5 million, only 7,000 have the right to work. Everyone else works illegally for little money, no job security. There's few university places. 2/3 of Syrian children in Turkey are out of school. Many work. You'll remember this picture and the little boy in the arms of the Turkish gendarme person, Alan Kurdi. 3 years old when he died last September off the Turkish coast of Bodrum, along with his mum and his elder brother. Now, and perhaps you'll remember the backlash that started after the initial sympathetic coverage subsided. People started asking, why did the father, Abdullah Kurdi, put his sons' lives at risk? They were known to live safely in Turkey. Why did he risk their lives at sea? How could he possibly justify that? The week after Alan Kurdi died, I retraced the family's life in Istanbul, and I found Abdullah Kurdi's workplace. It was a workshop, a sweatshop, in a basement where people from dawn till dusk would sew Islamic garments for €7 a day. Now that wasn't enough to keep supporting his family, so he had to send his little sons back to Syria, back into a war zone. And then he got a better job for €10 a day, so he could take them and rent a little flat. But still, it wasn't quite enough to provide for them. And he knew his eldest son was nearing school age. So he did what so many others did at the same time. They looked to Europe for a better life. They'd exhausted the legal options, of which there are few. They didn't get a visa. And the Kurdish tragedy has become famous, but their story isn't unique. Many Syrians feel they are treated as second-grade human beings in Turkey, allowed to survive but not live in the same way that the local population is living a dignified, normal life. One Syrian friend of mine said when he went to Greece, when he chose to risk his life, it was actually the first time he felt he was able to choose his own destiny in years. And he didn't go searching for safety. He went to look for a life beyond survival. Now, last week, the EU started sending asylum seekers back from Greece to Turkey. And that's controversial enough. But if we ignore what drives people across the sea, it's actually not even going to work. And now here, I'm meant to tell you what the solution is to this, but there's no magic fix. We can only mitigate the current crisis, but we can look ahead. We can change our approach to future refugee crises, because if the last year has shown us one thing, it is that the current system is broken. There's 60 million displaced people in the world, more than ever before since the Second World War. Now, wealthy nations, like the European Union, need to take on responsibility instead of, as before, simply letting poorer neighboring countries and aid organizations leave them to deal with the consequences of the refugees. And pledges for resettlement, for financial aid need to be kept up because there's an enormous problem that, say, the World Food Programme can't feed the refugees in Jordan because they don't have enough money. Last year, the UNHCR's appeal only brought in 20% of the funds needed to care for all the refugees. So we need a new system that, when there's a large-scale refugee crisis, integrates the refugees into the host community's economy and education system. And there needs to be an orderly resettlement plan for especially vulnerable people and children that must take the place of sea crossings. And perhaps we need to talk about an international quota system to be activated for resettlement in case of a refugee crisis like the one we're seeing right now. And you might say, well, but this continent cannot possibly take in this many people from such a different culture. After the Vietnam War, the West actually resettled more than 1 million Vietnamese. So we've done it before, and that was during the Cold War. So surely Europe, now more prosperous and more stable, is capable of doing the same thing again.